always hate stopping the music. We only have a 2-minute timer at the beginning of class, and I love these songs so much. How's everybody doing? It's great to be learning with you on a Thursday night. A guten Erev Shabbos and a happy Yom Ha'atzmaut, celebrating the birth of the state of Israel 70-something years ago. All right, let's light up the darkness. Who is with us on a Thursday evening? David in Indiana, Yehudit in Florence, South Carolina. Tom says shalom. Paula is here. Guy in Dayton, Ohio. Melissa in Great Neck. James in Indianapolis. Karen in Northern California. Ruth in Kentucky. Nancy in North Carolina. Paula in Chicago. Steve in New Hampshire. Lucy in Minnesota. Bill, we'll have to catch it on the replay. Bella in Florida. Christina in Texas. Yehudit sending love. And over there on the YouTube side, Patrice in Utah, Aoife in Florida. Welcome, everybody. What can I say? That song was called Pe'ero from Eitan Katz Unplugged album number 2. Okay, yes, I said the title of today's show, today's class is Not for First Timers. If this is your first time tuning in to our Talmud class, our Daf Yomi Talmud class, doing one page a day, working our way through the entire Talmud over a 7.5-year cycle. So today's not the best day to join us for the first time. This is definitely adult material. Sometimes it's not a great time to join us if it's your first day, just because it's so complicated and intricate and the arguments are so difficult to follow and they can become so technical. Today, not a great day to join us for the first time because, it's just very adult material. Okay? So, it's not always like this if you're joining us for the first time. We are in Tractate Yevamos. These are the laws of Eboom, levirate marriage, the obligation of a brother to step in and marry the widow of his brother if his brother died, married but childless. We are in chapter 6 today, doing Mishna number 3 on page 59 of this tractate. And I believe that puts us a little bit past the halfway point of our tractate. We're studying the laws of levirate marriage, but as we've seen particularly in this chapter, that the way Yibum is achieved, levirate marriage is achieved, is through having intercourse between the brother and the widow. And so the sages have been defining exactly what is intercourse, and what are the ramifications when people have intercourse, not only in a Yibum setting, but also, if there's a betrothal and if it's accomplished through intercourse or not through intercourse, if the bride and groom have entered the canopy but have not had intercourse yet. We've done a lot of cases with a priest, right? So a priest is not allowed to marry a divorcee. When have they violated that prohibition? Is it when they were betrothed, promised to marry, which is the same as marriage in the sense that to break off a betrothal requires a bill of divorce, a get? Or is that prohibition of a priest marrying a divorcee only actually violated when they have intercourse, when they consummate the marriage? Or perhaps an in-between step when the bride and groom enter underneath the wedding canopy, the chuppah, which in ancient times wasn't necessarily a shawl, a prayer shawl held over the bride and groom like we see in modern times, but it was an actual place of seclusion where they went to consummate the marriage. Well, what if they enter the place of seclusion, but they don't actually consummate? Is it enough that they entered the place where everyone would have assumed that they consummated the union? These are the kinds of questions we've been asking. Here now in the third Mishnah of chapter 6, we're actually going to talk about the requirements of a high priest, right? So not just a priest, but a high priest. The Torah specifies that a high priest not only is prohibited to marry a divorcee like any priest, but he may not even marry a widow. He must marry a virgin, so a girl who's been with no other man. And because the Torah goes a little further and says not only a maiden who has not known a man, but a virgin in her virginity. And from that extra language, the sages are going to learn out some additional requirements, and that is what we're discussing today in this, as I said, very adult class that we'll be having today. Okay, so Mishnah number 3 of chapter 6. A high priest may not marry a widow, whether she is a widow from betrothal or a widow from marriage, right? So Erisin was betrothal. Nisuin was the consummation of that marriage. And so, it's because Erisin, betrothal, counts as marriage in the sense that to break it off, you need a bill of divorce. So it might have been that a woman was betrothed to a man, never consummated that marriage, and then the man died. So she's a widow from betrothal. And now we're understanding that a high priest may not even marry a widow from betrothal. And he may not marry a grown woman. And we'll get into what that means. He may marry only a minor or a young woman. Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Shimon declare a grown woman fit to marry a high priest. And he may not marry a woman whose hymen was torn accidentally. The sages taught. The verse, now the Gemara. The sages taught. The verse states with regard to a high priest, a widow he shall not take. That's Leviticus 21:14, which prohibits him from marrying any widow, whether she is a widow from betrothal or a widow from marriage. And the Gemara is surprised by this statement. This is obvious, as the verse is referring to a widow. It just says widow. It doesn't qualify widow from what. And since a woman who is betrothed to a man is considered married to him in the sense that they are both prohibited to other people in the world, and to break off a betrothal requires a bill of divorce, so it is considered a form of marriage. And since it says he may not marry a widow without further specification, we would know that he can't marry a widow whether from complete marriage or even betrothal. So why does this need to be stated? This is obvious as the verse is referring to a widow without further specification. The Gemara answers, it is necessary, lest you say that one should derive a verbal analogy from the words widow and widow used in two different contexts, where widow here, that a high priest may not marry a widow, and widow there in Genesis 38:11, which is talking about the story of Tamar, right? So Judah, one of the 12 sons of Jacob, his son married a woman named Tamar. His son died. Then his second son married Tamar, but didn't want to build up his brother's house, and so he spilled his seed rather than, have sex in a way that would produce children with Tamar. And the Lord was unhappy with that. And then Onan, the second son, died. And now Judah was unwilling or hesitant to marry Tamar off to his third son, now that two of his sons had married Tamar and then died. But in any case, in that passage, Tamar is referred to as a widow, and she was a widow from full marriage. So you might have thought that every case of a widow must be like Tamar, who was not just a widow from betrothal, but a widow from marriage. And just as there Tamar was a widow from marriage, so too here the verse might be referring only to a widow from marriage. The Tana of our Mishnah therefore teaches us that this is not the case. The Gemara asks, and say that it is indeed so. Maybe that is true. We should learn out that it only means a widow from full marriage and not from betrothal, that the suggested verbal analogy is correct. And the Gemara answers, it is similar to the case of a divorcee. Just as a divorcee is forbidden to an ordinary priest, as opposed to a high priest, whether she was divorced from marriage or from betrothal, so too a widow is forbidden to a high priest, whether she is a widow from marriage or from betrothal. It was taught in our Mishnah and a high priest may not marry a grown woman. So the sages taught that the verse, and he shall take a wife in her virginity, excludes a grown woman whose hymen was torn away, i.e. it is no longer as complete as that of a minor or a young woman. This is the statement of Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Shimon disagree with Rabbi Meir, and they declare that a grown woman is fit to marry a high priest. And the Gemara asks, with regard to what do they disagree? What is the basis of this disagreement between Rabbi Meir on the one side and Rabbis Elazar and Shimon on the other side? The Gemara explains, Rabbi Meir holds that were the verse referring simply to a virgin, a woman who had never had intercourse with a man, it would have indicated that even a woman with partial signs of virginity, like a grown woman, is permitted. Since the verse states her virginity, it means that she is fit to marry a high priest only if all the signs of her virginity are intact, which excludes a grown woman. We're not going to get into a biology lesson here, but the hymen, this membrane of skin that covers the vagina of a girl, even if she doesn't have sex with a man, as she gets older, it doesn't cover her private parts in the same way as it did when she was younger. And it seems that for the high priest, it has to be a woman not only who has never known a man, but has this, intact expression of virginity, physical expression of virginity, as it were. So Rabbi Meir holds that were the verse referring simply to a virgin, it would have indicated that even a woman with partial signs of virginity, i.e. a grown woman, would be permitted. Since the verse states her virginity, it means that she's fit to marry a high priest only if all the signs of her virginity are intact, which excludes a grown woman. The full expression in her virginity indicates that if she has experienced sexual intercourse in a typical manner, which takes place in the area of her virginity, i.e. her hymen, yes, she is disqualified from marrying a high priest. But if she had sex in a manner that would not affect the hymen, meaning atypical sex, which is the euphemism used here for anal intercourse, then no, she would not be disqualified. But Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Shimon hold that were the verse referring simply to a virgin, it would have indicated that only a complete virgin is fit to marry a high priest, but not a grown woman. When it states her virginity, it indicates that even a woman with partial signs of virginity, i.e. a grown woman, is fit to marry the high priest. And the full expression in her virginity indicates that she is not fit to marry a high priest unless all of her virginity is intact, i.e. she has not engaged in intercourse of any kind, whether typical or atypical. Rav Yehuda said that Rav said, if she had atypical sexual intercourse, she is disqualified from marrying the high priest. Rav raised an objection based upon a baraisa. The verse states with regard to rape, and she shall be his wife. Deuteronomy 22:19. And the sages explain that this is referring only to a woman who is suitable for him. So there what the verse in Deuteronomy is talking about is that it is a penalty of the rapist that if a man rapes a woman, he's now responsible for her. And if she wants, hard to imagine, but if she wants, he has to marry her. She doesn't have to marry him against her will. But in some, it might be a situation where this was a wealthy man who thought that he could just exploit, this woman who was sort of, powerless and disenfranchised in other ways and take advantage of her. And then it became known to the public that he did that. So then he would be forced to marry her and thus be forced to provide for her, right? That's a separate punishment for the rape. However, if it's a priest who raped a divorced woman or a high priest who raped a widow, so then that part of the consequences of the rape, that he would also have to marry her and provide for her, does not apply because he is prohibited to marry her. Likewise, for a chalutza, right? A priest cannot marry a woman who has been through a Eboom situation and perform chalitza with her Yevam, because a chalutza is considered like a divorcee. Now, the Gemara clarifies, what are the circumstances of this law if we say that the high priest raped her by engaging in typical intercourse? Why does the Baraisa specifically state that she is forbidden to him because she is a widow? Let him derive this law from the fact that she is now a non-virgin. He raped her. They weren't married. So now she's not a virgin, and a high priest cannot marry somebody who is not a virgin. In fact, a priest cannot marry a woman who's not a virgin. Rather, is it not that he had atypical intercourse with her? And due to the fact that she is a widow, yes, that is the reason she is forbidden. But due to the fact that she is a non-virgin, no, that is not the reason she is forbidden. And this indicates that a woman who had intercourse in an atypical manner is not considered a non-virgin and is not disqualified from marrying a high priest. It's worth noting that, the discussions that they're having, and here sort of pulling from the law of whether a priest is permitted or obligated to marry a woman that he raped, depending on whether he raped her in the typical manner or in the atypical manner, they're just using that law to pull out a principle about the difference between typical and atypical, or about the difference between virgin and non-virgin. When the sages are discussing these laws, they're always basically in a hypothetical context. When they're actually talking about an incident that happened, they say so. Otherwise, it's all hypothetical. And because they're just discussing principles and drawing principles from various laws, and the Talmud is written in such a terse fashion, meant to be memorized, right? The whole idea of the oral tradition is that it's meant to be memorized and given over from teacher to student. Eventually, it was written down so that it wouldn't be lost due to all the persecution, but it remains written in a very terse, short fashion. So what they don't bother to put in is kind of the emotional judgment, statements like, it is appalling, but we learn. It is shocking, but we learn. It is upsetting, but we learn, which is the way that we talk about situations like that in modern times. The fact that they don't include language like that doesn't mean that they were comfortable with these kinds of cases and imagining what would happen in such a case and what the law would be. It means that there's only so much room in the sort of memorization and codification of these Mishnas and Gemaras, that they don't include emotional context. They're only talking about what is the law and what is the principle that would apply. Okay. So where was I? What was the circumstance? Okay, so now we're on 59b. The Gemara refutes this proof. In accordance with whose opinion is this Baraisa that we're discussing? It is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Meir, who maintains that a woman who engaged in atypical intercourse is permitted to a high priest. And when Rav said his statement, it was in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Elazar, who holds that such a woman is disqualified from marrying a high priest. Right? If she never had, vaginal sex, but she had some other kind of sex, is she still a virgin who is qualified to marry a priest or not? Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Elazar disagree on that. The Gemara asks, if Rav's statement is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Elazar, why did he specifically state that she is forbidden to him because she is a non-virgin? Let him derive it from the fact that she is a zona, meaning a woman who practiced, who had sex with somebody who was not permitted to her. Whether it was willingly or not, the fact is she had sex with somebody who was not permitted to her. As Rabbi Elazar said, even in the case of an unmarried man who had intercourse with an unmarried woman, not for the purpose of marrying her, he has thereby caused her to become a zona. Rav Yosef said, when Rav said that a woman who had atypical sex is disqualified from marrying a high priest, he was referring to a woman who had intercourse with an animal. As there, she is disqualified because she is a non-virgin, but she is not disqualified because of the prohibition of a zona. Right? A zona is somebody who had sex with a human who was not permitted to her. Now we're talking about somebody who had, performed bestiality, which would render her a non-virgin, but not a zona. So Abaye said to him, whichever way you look at it, there is a difficulty with this answer. If she is considered a non-virgin, she should also be a zona. And if she is not a zona, she is also not a non-virgin. Unless you say that it is analogous to a case of a woman who lost her virginity via penetration by a foreign object atypically, and whose hymen was therefore not damaged, and she is not forbidden as a zona because she didn't have sex with a man, but she had sex with an object, yet she is still no longer considered a virgin, but that is not correct. If so, if such a woman is considered a non-virgin and forbidden to a high priest, you would have no woman in the world who is fit for the high priest. Why? Why would you say that? Because every woman would be considered to have lost her virginity via penetration by a foreign object atypically, when you consider that in ancient times, when they went to the bathroom, number two, they didn't have toilet paper, and they didn't have a bidet, and they didn't have a tushy, stream of water to clean behind. What did they use? They used a pebble. Right? They used like a little rock to wipe their butts. And so this little pebble that you use to wipe your butt, if you're wiping your butt with it, perforce, some little, corner of the rock would have, gone, in a little bit past the plane of the outside to the inside. And that would have rendered every man and woman in the world, non-virgins in the atypical manner. So obviously that's not the case. So you wouldn't say that somebody, who had some kind of penetration in the atypical manner would thereby be rendered a non-virgin. You don't say that. So rather, Rabbi Zera said that Rav was referring to one who refused her husband after having only atypical intercourse with him. What is refusal? The act of refusal is when a girl's father has died and her mother or brothers marry her off to an adult man. She is a minor girl, so she has the right to say no. She can say, I don't want to marry this man. And so even though she was married to him, whether betrothed or fully married, but if she then refuses, so she returns to her family home, and she's not considered a divorcee, she's considered somebody who was never married at all. Nevertheless, while she was in the home of this man to whom her mother or brothers married her, if she had atypical sex with that man, was raped by that man essentially, so that act of intercourse is not considered licentious because they were married. She is nevertheless disqualified from marrying into the priesthood because she is not a virgin. Right? She is one who refused, but actually that's not going to end up being the law. Now, Rabbi Shimi Bar Chia said, a woman who had intercourse with an animal is like one whose hymen was torn accidentally. Consequently, she is not a zona, and she is fit for the priesthood. She is fit to marry a priest. This is also taught in a baraisa. If a woman had intercourse with one who is not a man, i.e. an animal, although she is liable to stoning, this is a death penalty offense, having sex with an animal, if she did so intentionally and in the presence of witnesses who forewarned her of her punishment, she is nevertheless fit for the priesthood. Now, she won't receive the death penalty unless she was warned not to do it, and then she did it anyway in the presence of two witnesses who warned her, and then she did it like right away after the warning and still did it. That's the only case where it become a capital offense. But still, there could be witnesses where it doesn't end up being a capital offense, but okay, she did it. Is she rendered unfit for the priesthood? They're saying here, no. Right? If a woman had intercourse with one who is not a man, i.e. an animal, although she is liable to stoning if she did so intentionally and in the presence of witnesses who forewarned her of her punishment, she is nevertheless fit for the priesthood because she's not a zona or a non-virgin despite that act. Now, when Rav Dimi came from the land of Israel to Bavel, right, to the Jewish community in Babylonia, he said there was an incident involving a certain girl in the village of Hitlu who was sweeping the house, and a village dog used for hunting jumped on her from behind and sodomized her. And Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, Rebbe, permitted her to marry a priest as she was not considered a zona. And Shmuel said it was not her fault and she didn't do anything wrong. Shmuel said, and Rabbi Yehuda Nasi permitted her even to a high priest as she was still considered a virgin. And the Gemara is puzzled by this comment. Was there a high priest in the days of Rebbe? Rebbe was the head of the Sanhedrin at the time that the Mishna was codified, 200 years into the Common Era and 130 years after the temple was destroyed. There was no high priest at that time. Rather, Shmuel meant that Rebbe rendered her fit to marry a high priest. Why were they adjudicating that? Why were they adjudicating that? Just because as a matter of law. So Rava of Pirkin said to Rav Ashi, from where is this matter derived that the sages stated that there is no harlotry, that a woman is not rendered a zona, with regard to an animal? And Rav Ashi responded that this is as it is written. Deuteronomy 23:19, you shall not bring the hire of a harlot or the price of a dog into the house of the Lord your God for any vow, for both of them are an abomination to the Lord your God. This verse prohibits one from sacrificing an animal as an offering in the temple if that animal was ever used to pay a harlot for her services, or if it was ever used as a payment in the purchase of a dog. And we learned in a Mishnah in Tractate Timura on page 30, the hire of a dog, i.e. a kosher animal that a man or woman gave as a payment to the owner of a dog in order to have sexual intercourse with the dog, and similarly, the price of a prostitute, i.e. a kosher animal used to purchase a prostitute not for her services as a prostitute, but as a slave, a maidservant, these are permitted to be sacrificed as offerings. And this is because it is stated that both of them, the specific items listed in our verse in Deuteronomy, are abominations. Consequently, only 2 items are prohibited, i.e. the payment given to a prostitute for her services and the payment used to purchase a dog. But not 4 items are prohibited to be brought as sacrifices in the temple, as the reverse cases are excluded from this law. To clarify that, kosher animals given as payment for the services of a prostitute or used to pay for the purchase of a dog are then rendered unfit to be sacrificed as offerings in the temple. However, the reverse is not true. A kosher animal given as payment for the purchase of a prostitute so that she would become a slave, or the payment to a dog's owner for permission to have intercourse with the dog, those animals remain fit to be used as sacrifices because they're not included in that other case specified in the Torah and labeled an abomination. The sages taught a high priest may not marry a woman that he himself raped and a woman that he himself seduced, as he is commanded to marry a virgin. He will have to pay damages and have other punishment for rape, but the obligation of a rapist to marry his victim, if that's what she wants, and therefore his obligation to provide for her, will not apply to a high priest, since he is not permitted to marry a woman who's not a virgin, even if he himself raped her or seduced her. And if he married her, he is married. So he's not allowed to marry her. But if he did marry her, he stays married. With regard to a woman who was raped by another man and a woman seduced by another man, he may not marry her. And if he married her, Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov says that the child born from this union is a halal, a Kohen who's not permitted to serve as a priest. And the rabbis say the lineage of the offspring is unflawed, meaning he is not a halal, not a priest who is prohibited to serve in the temple. The Gemara analyzes this baraisa. I'm almost done, by the way. If you have questions or comments, please get them in. It states that if he married the woman that he himself raped or seduced, he is married. Rav Huna said that Rav said, and he must divorce her. He's not allowed to stay married to her. And he must give her a bill of divorce. And the Gemara asks, but consider that which the Baraisa teaches. If he married her, he is married. Since it is obvious that the marriage is technically valid, it must be saying that they are permitted to remain married. And Rav Acha Bar Yaakov said, no, it's not saying that if he married her, even though he's prohibited to marry her, but then if he did marry her, he can stay married. That's what the Baraisa seems to say. Rav Acha Bar Yaakov says, no, that's not what the Baraisa is saying. It means to say that he does not pay the fine of a seduced woman. One who seduced a woman and does not wish to marry her must pay damages to her. Since in this case he did marry her, he is not liable to pay the fine, even though he is required to divorce her. Now the Gemara relates that when Rav Geviha went from Beit Ketil, he stated this law before Rav Ashi, who said to him, isn't it Rav and Rabbi Yochanan who both say a high priest may not marry a grown woman and a woman whose hymen was torn accidentally, but if he married one of them, he remains married? Apparently, the reason for this law is that since she will eventually be a grown woman under him, i.e. while married to him, and she will eventually be a woman whose hymen was torn under him, as she will not remain a virgin once they're married, so they are permitted to remain married after the fact. Ab initio, he's not allowed to marry her, but if he did marry her, he may remain married. Here too, in the case of a high priest who married a woman that he raped or seduced, since she will eventually be a non-virgin under him, the Baraisa should be understood as stating that they may remain married. Again, it's consensual for her. She doesn't have to marry a man that raped her, even if he's the high priest. But if she desires that, he may marry her. He may not marry her, but if he did, they may remain married. And the Gemara concludes, indeed, this is difficult for Rav Huna's interpretation of the Baraisa. That's where we end. Tomorrow we'll pick it up at the regular Friday time, noon Pacific, on page 60. Okay, let's see if there's any questions or comments on this. I know that Nina had to go out, so I will scan the comments. Sharon, as a dog owner, I am horrified by much of this. I agree. Okay. Okay. Let's just go back a little bit up. Lucy says, so then the high priest can never participate in Eboom. Right. So that's very interesting, right? So can a high priest participate in Eboom? No, because a high priest cannot marry a widow. And a Eboom situation only occurs when there is a widow. Exactly. So if the only brother of the one who died, so the only Yavam happens to be a high priest, presumably they would have to perform chalitza since he's not allowed to marry her. And the question that we might have asked is, well, wait a minute, maybe she's just exempt. They don't even need chalitza since he's prohibited to marry her. And I think we've encountered that question already, and I can't remember because I think the question was, how strong is that prohibition? Is that a prohibition by Torah law? Yeah, it seems so. So that would be analogous to the prohibition that of a Yavam who has, one of the prohibited relationships with the Yavama. Like, she happened to also be related to the surviving brother through some other familial relationship, which would render it incest if they were to marry and perform Yibum. In that case, she doesn't have to perform chalitza, she's just exempt. So maybe if the high priest is the only Yavam, maybe it would be just exempt and chalitza not even necessary. But I can't remember if that was the law or not. Sharon, whose house would Tamar have been building up? The first or the second of the brothers? So she was twice widowed. For sure, the first brother needed to be, they were married, never had kids, and he died. The second brother never had intercourse with her. But I think he did actually, right? The way that it was described is that they had intercourse, but then he spilled his seed on the ground. Now, that was definitely a prohibited act, but the fact is he had intercourse with her. So therefore, they were fully married, and now she's a widow of two different brothers. So it's a great question, Sharon. If the youngest brother, or in the end, it was Judah himself who married Tamar, so whose heir would the offspring be considered? The first brother who died or the second brother who died? It's a great question, and I don't know the answer. David, there you go, talking about the hymen again. The hymen is very elastic, much like a scrunchie. I'm so inexpert in women's reproductive biological system that I just will not comment. I don't know the answer there. If a high priest rapes a woman, do they let him stay a high priest? See, that would be the kind of question we would ask today, and it would be such a logical question. How could this guy remain the high priest? I think that probably, Lucy, you're right. I think they would not allow him to remain the high priest. He would have somehow disqualified himself from being the high priest. But they're not addressing that part of the law. They're not addressing the law. Would he remain the high priest? What damages would he owe as the high priest? Right now, they're only looking at the narrow question. Would he be permitted to marry this woman? Would be obligated to marry that woman? And in the and if they didn't let him remain the high priest, that would be interesting as well, because then that particular aspect of the prohibition would go away. So it's a great question, and I'm not sure how that would play out. And Sharon says the same thing. Yikes, a high priest raping a woman, he should be fired from his position. It reminds me of what my mother used to say about duchening, right? When Kohanim, this is something we still do today, that the descendants of Aaron, who are Cohens, will bless the congregation on holidays outside of Israel and every day in Israel. They say the Kohanic blessing: may the Lord bless you and keep you, may the Lord countenance you and be gracious to you, may the Lord favor you and grant you shalom. That's called duchening, when the Cohens, the priests, right, the descendants of Aaron, will bless the congregation from the front of the room. So Sharon's mother used to say about duchening, I don't want blessings through those people. I know those guys. Okay. I guess you were talking about somebody in particular. We'll just leave it at that. Magari Citadel, nothing will be done to him because all are the same. Hyenas in priest clothes. The wolves have much honor in their lifestyle than these creatures. I cannot agree with that. No, it's not that what you're looking at here is the record of some patriarchal society where they just abused women right and left, and that's why their language is so callous. I 100% disagree with that. They're just talking about what the law would be. Now, we do have a record that there was a tremendous amount of corruption in the priesthood in the Second Temple period, and there was an extraordinary number of high priests because of that corruption. And I think many of them would become high priests, through bribery or just to get the honor, and they would know that a high priest who's not, a spiritually qualified high priest, who didn't get that position in the right way, would die when he entered the Holy of Holies on Yom Kippur, and so they would, resign before that happened. But these laws applied equally in the First Temple period, when most high priests served for something like 40 years, and they would enter the Holy of Holies and emerge unscathed, as it were. And so, they didn't bring a sinful past into the Holy of Holies with them. So, we're not going to cast aspersions on an entire class of people just because we want to be gossiping among ourselves, right? We don't do that. So, there. Okay, so we'll leave it there. This was not an easy class, very adult material, but I think it's a credit to this group, who's really with us every day and who's learning and taking the learning seriously, that when we encounter topics like this, that are of an adult nature, and, you wouldn't teach this material to the youngsters in yeshiva, you wait for the adults to teach this too. But it's not easy material in a lot of different ways. But as I mentioned earlier, and I mentioned again, the rabbis, the sages of the Mishnah and of the Gemara were processing this material, through the lens of what is the law in these various situations. And they'll analyze these questions in the same way that they'll analyze, was an offering brought on the altar a proper offering? Even hundreds of years later, when the temple was destroyed, no offerings could be brought. Is a contract a valid contract? When somebody, buys a horse from another person and the horse got damaged on the road, stuff that is much easier to discuss and that involves, contract laws and disputes that are very analogous to what goes on even today. The law of buying a horse is similar to the law of buying a used car today. These kinds of laws are much easier to discuss. But today we encountered challenging material, and God willing, we did so like adults. That's what I've got for us tonight. And with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow at the Friday time, noon Pacific. Have a great night.